Right. Well, welcome to the St. Patty's Day edition of the Citizen Oversight Board meeting. The luck of the board, as it were, is that the main focus of today is the launch of our annual report, and our Vice Chair, Nick Weber, will talk us through that. So excited to have some broad conversations about that. We're having some board members who are having a hard time getting in on a link. So we will wait to establish our quorum and do our voting in a minute. So just wanted to maybe first turn it over to Nick to kind of review the contents and approach to our annual report. If folks who are attending have questions, we're happy to receive those either in the Q&A or I think in the chat. I can't remember if folks can chat. Yeah. So happy to field questions and have discussion. And then, of course, if the monitor's office would like to say anything about our annual report, you're not required to, but happy to have that as well. Nick, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I think Daniel's going to do the slide. So hopefully everyone can see that. And just a quick thank you, worked very collaboratively with Daniel, but he did a lot of the heavy lifting on putting this PowerPoint presentation together. So we did complete several drafts and have finalized the annual report, which I believe is available on the COB website, and maybe Daniel can put it in the chat if people are looking for it. We can go to slide 2. So just to kind of walk through big picture what the slide presentation covers, which is all covered in the annual report, are these 5 items that big accomplishments that we wanted to highlight, some of the major city events that we as a community have all sort of observed and walked through collectively as a community, some assessments of the Office of the Independent Monitor, some of our ongoing concerns, and then some of our recommendations and things that we're keeping an eye on for 2023. So some of our, I think our highlight real board accomplishments, obviously, and Elizabeth Castle is here with us, hiring a new monitor. I was brought on sort of in March, April of last year, so I was not part of the first round of interviews, but there was a lot of engagement, it sounds like, and a lot of work that went into the first round. And as somebody that participated in the hiring of Liz Castle, which we were all super excited about, there's just a lot of work that went into that, just at the community organizing level and resume reviewing level. And so there was just a lot of work, and the board poured a lot of time into that. The other big highlight is implementation of the PID policies. This was also something that I sort of caught the tail end of as I was joining the board last year, but my understanding is that Nikki Brazel, who's a former board member, and Stefan put a lot of time into this in terms of making sure that a lot of the recommendations made by the Citizen Oversight Board were sort of taken into consideration by the Public Integrity Division, and there was a really big shift in how the I guess complaints were handled through the Department of Safety, but then also making sure the language in the PID policy conformed with a lot of what our hopes for from the Citizen Oversight Board end of things, and it sounds like it was a very collaborative effort. The third big thing that we were able to get through this year, or excuse me, in 2022, was the strategic planning. We engaged an outside agency to have a series of meetings to make sure that we sort of stayed on message and focused, because when we talk about citizen oversight and watching, police and safety personnel, that you can go in a myriad of directions. So we wanted to make sure that we were collaborating in sort of a focused and intentional way. And so the strategic planning meetings really helped us sort of collaborate and come up with really great ideas for 2023, and then 5 years out, and having sort of a macro level plans to make sure that we stay moving forward. And then the fourth thing is that the new webpage, which I believe is either shared in the chat, or maybe Daniel can put that in the chat. But the Oversight in Denver webpage has got a lot of really great information, not just for the Citizen Oversight Board, but how all the different agencies and oversight agencies keep an eye on things, and how community members can reach out and be engaged in that process. So the website is new, and I would encourage community members to take a look at that. Then just to kind of like highlight a lot of the work that the board has done. I mean, we've had over 2022, there were 17 meetings. The strategic planning that I already talked about, there were 7 different public forums, some non-public forum meetings. And then we also had a community event, which was the Servicios de la Raza cookout. And I think our board member Larry has been actively working on sort of upping the community outreach and event, which is built into our strategic plan. And we want to be much more engaged and focused in community outreach. I think 2022 was a year of making sure we had an independent monitor selected, and a lot of hours and work went into that, and making sure the PID policies were assessed and implemented. And so with a lot of that groundwork laid, that leaves us with some room, and Larry's already been very busy getting to that, making sure that we are out in the community. So we're looking forward to events like that moving into 2023. Okay. So just some highlights. Obviously, a lot of the community members already know about some of these larger issues. A lot of the George Floyd protests lawsuits settled or ended in verdicts, and so that happened in March, and there were some other settlements against DPD. Then in July, we all know about the DPD shooting in Lodo, and that's an ongoing investigation, and something obviously that the independent monitor is waiting for the criminal litigation to get finished and sort of in keeping with policy. But that is something that obviously the Citizen Oversight Board is taking very seriously. And then in August, Chief Pizon retired, and then we had Chief Ron Thomas, who's already met with us twice, and has been very willing to meet with us in those public meetings, but also engage in difficult conversations about policing policies and best next steps for his agency. In November, the Department of Safety opened the AIDS Center, which I believe a few of the board members were able to go and visit. I was not able to go, but it is downtown near the Justice Center. And the AIDS Center is a place where hopefully places like that in Denver are going to be able to sort of creatively divert what would normally be people who are arrested, taken into custody, and sit in jail for a day or two and then get released on low-level things, when maybe the issues and causes of contact with law enforcement can be diverted to something like the AIDS Center. So we're excited to see how that unfolds. We also heard from and met with people from the STAR program, which was, it sounds like, was focused in specific areas in Denver, but has had sort of repeated rounds of increased funding because the information and sort of the metrics, I guess, is the way I imagine Daniel describing it. But the measurements of how successful STAR has been something that everyone's keeping an eye on, and is really exciting, because the STAR program essentially means that Chief Thomas doesn't have to send police officers out there. There could be a different method for sort of unwinding tense situations and in giving community support, which I think helps with trust for Denver police, along with just helping individuals in the community. So there've been like a series of budget increase and things just like practical things, like getting them more vans, subcontracting with Servicios de la Raza for follow-up care, so there's more wraparound services, and that their budget has been increased in 2023. So we're likely going to see a huge increase in the number of calls that they're able to handle, which means maybe police officers and squad cars are not showing up there, and it's the STAR van and people getting sort of the whatever the crisis help is that they need, kind of a situation. So the annual report also obviously is, as part of the charter, requires that we assess the independent monitor, and it can't be said enough, just the gratitude that the Citizen Oversight Board has for the work that Greg Crittenden has put in, whether it's a meeting with us or meeting with us publicly, talking with us through various aspects of the work that they're doing and the team members and all of the hard work that they've put in. But he has been steering the ship, so to speak, for over 2 years. And we're just very grateful for all of the hard work that Greg put into it. And it sounds like all of the reviews and everybody is just from the independent monitor has just been very grateful for how things have been working through Greg. And then obviously I already mentioned Liz Castle taking over, and she's joining us here today as well. So we're just in a very good position because of all the hard work that Greg did, and a great handoff from Greg to Liz. And it's just been a very collaborative and exciting couple of months. And I think in addition to the staff surveys saying that, everyone has been very ecstatic about the work that Greg did over the last 2 years, there was an opportunity of sort of stakeholders from public safety agencies to, was there any complaints, changes, things that they would like to see, and just a resounding, it sounded like a thank you from the community and Department of Safety stakeholders to Greg. We can go to the next slide. So kind of digging into the annual reports that sort of highlighted concerns and things that the Oversight Board is keeping an eye on. Obviously, Leroy Taylor has been something that we've had conversations in public forums about. We've talked with the sheriff about this, but essentially, there's an ongoing investigation. So part of it is something that we don't have all the answers for, and there's a lawsuit pending. But I think there's sort of two takeaways, major takeaways. And one is obviously Leroy Taylor died at the jail, and we don't know if things could have been different if he had received medical attention in a timely fashion. But that is, just first and foremost, it's a tragedy. And so the Oversight Board is acknowledging that and acknowledging that pain from the family and the community to sort of feel that. And then on a more big picture macro level, we're also sort of digging into and taking a look at the fact that if there are complaints of a personnel who work at the Denver Sheriff's Department, a uniformed officer in the jail, there is a policy in place for when complaints come in and how that gets handled. There is less transparency when it comes to a Denver Health employee who is inside the jail. And so that's concerning to the board. And that doesn't have to be specific to just Leroy Taylor's tragic death. It's a larger situation where if individuals file complaints, what happens to those? Where do they go? What does that oversight look like? So that's something that is concerning to the board. Different, but similarly tragic is the passing of Maya King. This was covered pretty extensively in the news. I think the big concern, although there are many, or I guess I should say several things that we're looking at, is this idea that the 911 call was routed to an Aurora dispatch instead of Denver police dispatch. And this being a recurring or suspected recurring issue for people sort of in East Denver, especially where Colfax turns into Aurora, kind of that area like that. And also highlighting a larger issue of interpretation services for people who are non-English or non-Spanish speaking. How did those interpretation services through 911 get rolled out? And so those are concerns also that the board has. Other things that we have looked at, there's the STAR Community Advisory Committee, and suffice it to say, it sounds like there has been a breakdown in communication between the Community Advisory Committee and the Department of Public Health and Environment. And this exists sort of in the backdrop, while at the same time, like we mentioned earlier, the work that STAR is doing and sort of having the STAR vans go out and be sort of in the mix with the community and able to sort of alleviate issues where maybe police officers don't need to be there because it's mental health concerns or there are other community concerns that don't necessarily need the full response of Denver police officers. That's something that's very exciting, but we're also cognizant of this issue going on between the Community Advisory Committee and Department of Public Health and Environment. So that's, it's a concern of ours. It's on our radar, and we're acknowledging that that exists. And I think, where there is breakdown in communication, I think part of what we've learned from the Citizen Oversight Board end of things is that when there is transparency and when there is clear communication, there's a lot of groundwork to be gained and a lot of community trust to be built. And so hopefully that's something that, the community can, and the Citizen Oversight Board, to the extent that we can be involved, can use it as an opportunity to find ways to communicate and find ways to be as transparent as possible about what's going on. We also wanted to highlight and take a few moments to talk about Gene McCullough's death. There were several sort of like takeaways from the board end of things that, again, with the other deaths that the independent monitor had to investigate, this is also just tragic for the family. And so it's important for the Citizen Oversight Board to just start with that and acknowledge in our annual report that this is something that's family members lost somebody, and that's true of all these cases, and it's deeply tragic. And so what do we learn and what do we take away from that is that communication between how the investigation is going and family members is an opportunity for trust building in the community. And when there is no communication, that's also the opportunity to lose that trust and lose community engagement in a way that can be very sad and tragic. And the family members have, I think, in the news media made their feelings about how this was handled and the ultimate decision making process of the review through the policies. But I think also there's just an opportunity there. It shouldn't be missed for further communication and better communication. That's something that can be strived for and is a huge takeaway from that as well. So just some other concerns and highlights. The AIU policy that was signed back in June allows for the independent monitor really to be effective and good at its job, because where they need access to information is where they are able to help in that transparency, which ultimately the big picture being the community can trust what it can see. And so access to IA Pro for incoming complaints is something that we encourage and are something that we're concerned about when the Office of the Independent Monitor can't have access to that when they need to or how they need to. So that's a concern of ours, but also room for growth and room for improvement. The other item is, and we've heard from the sheriff several times, is just the understaffing at the Denver Sheriff's Department. And when we sort of compare what's going on with the Denver Sheriff's Department, that they are understaffed, which leads to a lot of the people who are there, dedicated to keeping the jails safe, being required to work overtime, being required to work long hours, and just being exhausted, versus what we know in terms of metrics from the Denver Police Department being, almost 95% staffed, and for uniformed officers, 90% staffed for non-uniformed officers. So it's a very noticeable difference, and just saying, we acknowledge that the sheriff comes to our meetings and lets us know that, and that they're making changes and moves to alleviate that, but that doesn't change the difficulties that they are currently facing right now. So that's one of our concerns as well. Obviously, and the board has met about this, and it's been in the media a great deal. The shooting in Lodo in July was front and center really for 2022. And there are some general takeaways, and part of it is, there's ongoing litigation. So the amount that the Office of the Independent Monitor can render opinions or get involved in investigation at this level, that's one thing that, sort of has to be put on the shelf for a moment. But I think the other takeaway is how quickly the community has access to body-worn camera, and how quickly messaging from agencies adequately communicates what happened or directs a narrative of what happens, and then later the body-worn camera comes out. And so that's an opportunity that could build trust in the community to say, here's the body-worn camera, we're not hiding anything, or we're going to wait on the body-worn camera and do things differently. And so that's sort of the big takeaway and concern from the Citizen Oversight Board end of things, that there's an opportunity for transparency, and when there is no transparency, or it's unclear exactly how that gets unfolded, then the community has, starts to lose trust, or that can be eroded. And so that's a concern of ours. Also, something that the Citizen Oversight Board has looked at and has a concern about is just the Denver Police Department Use of Force Board. The way that the Use of Force Board investigates and makes determinations. We are able to know that there are 5 members on the Force Review Board, 2 of whom are DPD commanders, and then the other people are community members, but who they are, how they get elected, what's their training, what's their role, how does that happen, we don't know. And kind of going back to our messaging of, where there's transparency, there's trust building, and when there's not transparency, there can be issues. And also just highlighting that the Citizen Oversight Board and the Independent Monitor were sort of made at the same time that the Force Review Board was created. And the idea being that there are 2 community members on the board, and what kind of oversight or involvement, what that looks like, what their role is, versus, lack of transparency kind of a thing. So that's a concern that's on our radar as well. Which we can roll into our recommendations from the Citizen Oversight Board. Obviously, just talking about the use of Force Review Board, a recommendation from the Citizen Oversight Board is we could have open applications for community members to participate, clear and transparent rotation in terms of how long people are term limited or what community members are they, and then publishing information just about membership, meetings, even just the training process or how that happens. There are ways to build trust there, and just improve transparency of existing ways for community members to engage with the Denver Police Department. We've talked to Chief Thomas about this. We know that there are possibilities for community members to go to their local district stations and go to these public meetings where they can sort of understand what's going on from law enforcement's perspective. We would just encourage Chief Thomas and the different district commanders to be vocal about that and public about that. They regularly sort of publish different social media, whether it's Twitter or whatever, items about investigations that they're doing or things that are going on, but would encourage them to also use that, medium to communicate, to Denver at large. When are you having these meetings? How can people be engaged? There have been discussions about making them available, just like this forum is. And, we can do a virtual meeting, or people attend virtually, those sorts of things. So that's a really great sort of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, way to increase community trust, just letting everyone know when can you go to that district substation and meet with the commanders to talk about what's going on. So that's something we would encourage as well. Other recommendations for the Denver Sheriff's Department, obviously, and we've heard repeatedly about the staffing issues and at the Denver Sheriff's Department. And so just encouraging, is there appropriate compensation? And also, non-financial issues like culture and wellness programs. We've heard, that they tried to do food trucks for the sheriffs downtown and other things like that, community building and outreach. And so we would just encourage them to continue down that road to handle the fact that they're at 65% capacity for the Denver Sheriff's Department. And then the Leroy Taylor situation comes into contrast with recommendation number 4, just that we encourage enhanced oversight with regard to medical staff and understanding that there's a lawsuit pending and there's only certain things that can be communicated to us. I think there's a bigger picture thing that I've already discussed, which is just that if there are complaints about medical staff, how is that handled? What is the oversight? And again, staying on messaging, just that when there is transparency, there's more trust. And so asking how those get handled and what the metrics are for that is going to be something that's helpful for the Denver Sheriff's Department. Other recommendations for the Denver Police Department and the Department of Safety, which it sounds like it's hopeful that we're moving in this direction, but just to have a public facing when complaints are filed or discipline cases are moving forward, that there could be a public facing portal where individuals who have filed a complaint can track that complaint, can see the results of it, and that there's just clear communication about what's going on with complaints, what stage it's at, and that there is the opportunity to build a lot of trust where people are communicating or just able to understand the various aspects of the different agencies that need to look at things, whether it's the Denver Police Department or the Department of Safety, and where it is in tracking that process. Then in terms of just for the Department of Public Safety, our another recommendation just in terms of sharing information that I mentioned this already before, but the Office of Independent Monitor having access to evidence.com and encouraging that it should have, it sounds like they do have some access to what they need, but then making sure that that is just a continued and ongoing discussion where if there are things on evidence.com that they can have access to, that they do, similar to the Lodo shooting, where there's body worn camera footage or things like that, share it promptly, share it quickly, and do so in a way that's sort of willing to accept what's going on in the video and talking about it openly and having that discussion quickly, because I think that lends itself to just more trust building in the community and the community saying, we got all the information and we got it right away. There was no delay. And then in addition to staffing at the Denver Sheriff's Department, it's also important to just sort of recognize that the sheriff has a fixed job where the Denver Police Department might be able to say, we have this many cars in circulation, or we have this many police officers, so we have to do patrols in these areas. That's just not the nature of the work for the Denver Sheriff's Department. So thinking creatively about how do we reduce the influx of individuals headed to the jail? And we mentioned this earlier, just in terms of if it's somebody exhibiting mental health issues or housing crisis issues, taking them to the jail and booking them in for a petty offense or a general sessions matter where they get released 2 or 3 days later does not alleviate the underlying issue, but does create a volume problem for the Sheriff's Department, which they work very hard to make sure everyone is safe. And so looking at other ways like the AIDS Center, which is very exciting, like the STAR program, in terms of like alleviating and helping the community in a way that can be Denver government involvement, in a way that also doesn't bring people who are struggling with financial issues, housing issues, drug issues, mental health issues, whatever it might be, to the jail, as sort of not making that the one size fits all remedy, is just bring them down to the Sheriff's Department. Let's try the AIDS Center, let's try STAR. And that the city, it seems to be looking at and expanding its efforts, whether it's clearing warrants or providing other methods of assistance, so that we're not just continuing to use the jail as a place to house people. I guess I could open up for questions, although I'll probably defer to Daniel, and then just making sure that the community has access to all of the various ways that they can get in touch with us, or if they wanted to let us know what they're thinking, and then the QR code gets them to the website as well. So just encouraging everyone to reach out and often.
Thank you, Nick, for that. So we do have one question, which is how can the public find the rules on body worn camera footage and what the chain of custody is? Community member says they're very concerned about the ability of law enforcement being able to manipulate footage, download, delete the original, and upload manipulated footage. Would any board members like to take that, or the Office of the Independent Monitor?
I can take a stab at it. It is my understanding that the system is in place that the body worn cameras cannot be manipulated in that way. It is simply an upload program, and then once it is transferred or docketed, it is a download program. But that is a very simplified, untechnical answer, but that is my understanding.
That's my understanding as well, in terms of how that technology works. There's like no editing capability.
And I guess I would also add that the Denver Police Department has their operating, the DPD operations manual is available online, and individuals can easily access the body worn camera policy in addition to what the law says. It's also it's written into their policy of how and when they turn it on, and when they're engaged with the public, et cetera. So that's easily accessible as well.
Yeah, last thing I'll say is that in the 2020-2021 legislative cycle, the Colorado State Legislature updated some of the laws regarding when and how body worn camera footage can be released to the public. And so now I believe the time frame is 20 days post an officer involved shooting or critical incident. And so sometimes that 20 days is a little bit longer. I think in recent cases it's not exactly clear in the law when the 20 days starts. And so I think we had a couple of cases where it was later than that, but they are required to release that to the public. One of the things that Nick highlighted in our annual report was, a concern we have is that particularly in the case of the Lodo shooting, the board didn't actually get access to the body worn camera footage before the public did. And so, if the board is supposed to be this public interface and trust building as Nick highlighted, we didn't really have access to that information before everybody else. So that's a concern in terms of process. We've been told by the Department of Public Safety that will be improved, and we hope that there's not another incident where we test that, but there likely will be. So just a little bit more context on that. Other questions, comments from community members? I also believe that the leader of the 911 for the city is on as an attendee. And so if you would like to talk about sort of anything related to our report, we're happy to have your commentary and feedback as well. I see you raising your hand. So Danielle, if you'd like to promote Andrew, that would be great. Andrew, just give us a sec. Great, welcome. Thanks for joining. And yeah, feel free to, let us know your thoughts on our concerns.
Sure. the couple of things that I did want to address, first around the STAR program. I saw, Nick, that you had on there the ability to request STAR only response, but didn't get a chance to kind of talk about that. That is a policy change that we have made as a part of how Denver 911 dispatches the STAR van. That is in response to direct feedback from the community. You know, when the pilot began, the STAR program was very much an alternative to law enforcement, right? But as they have been for nearly 6 decades, police was still the default. And so if STAR wasn't available, it was often then that, okay, then we're going to dispatch police like we have for a very long time. And what we are working on now, we have implemented that policy change where residents of the city can request that STAR van be the only response. And our call takers will verify that with the caller, and kind of try and manage those expectations and make sure that they understand that if STAR isn't available, it could be that no one responds. And are you okay with that? You know, as the program continues to expand, matter of fact, I just got an email that we've got a line on 3 more vans, which is very exciting. That's with supply chain constraints. That's been one of the long tent poles on this project. So as our capacity continues to grow, the chances that somebody requesting a STAR only response will continue to diminish. And then the only other thing that I think is worth mentioning is the tragedy of Ma King's murder did result in a lot of really good conversations with the East Colfax community. They have a lot of very active and passionate members of that community who have been not only seeking to make improvements, but seeking to understand how public safety processes work better. So I think we've established a very good kind of relationship, ongoing working relationship with them, both in answering questions, but also helping them kind of understand. We've had them out to 911 for tours to kind of see how the process works here, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with them. Beyond that, I'm happy to answer any specific questions that there may be.
Thanks. It's really helpful to have you, and it comes to mind that perhaps we should have you on as a regular guest of our show, and maybe we get that calendared so that we can, you know, maybe have a more structured conversation and not necessarily put you on the spot as a result of our annual report. You know, happy to take questions for board members too, since we do have Andrew on, but also happy to, you know, have a conversation that's more planned. All right, and Andrew, you're off the hook for now, but we'll be calling you and maybe get some time. I think, you know, talking about STAR, talking about, you know, dispatch, talking about your staffing levels. You know, I know there are lots of things happening with your organization that play a role in the entirety of the, you know, public safety infrastructure. So
I can give one more update there.
Sure, that's great.
Staffing at 911 has been a significant challenge. However, the training team here completely revamped our hiring process, the city's recruiting team, and it's been a big team effort. But Tuesday of this week, we brought on 29 new 911 call takers for the start of a 6-month academy. So we've got to get them through that 6-month academy. But today, 911's overall staffing sits at just under 96% of our authorized strength. So that's the best we've had since 2018, which is a tremendous improvement. So in the next 6 months, those folks will start getting released for independent duty, and then we'll actually see that impact on hold times and everything else. But we're moving in the right direction. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Congratulations on that. I know it's a really hard job to be a dispatcher. You know, you're receiving a lot of traumatic calls, and you know, being understaffed and also, you know, emotionally exhausted is a really hard job to do. So thanks for that update, and thanks for all your work on that. All right, well, other board member questions or comments in the Q&A? I think we don't have any additional questions from the public. Just maybe while board members are thinking if they have any others, just wanted to say thank you to the board on, a truly collaborative effort in developing this report. We are 9 independent thinkers, and Daniel does a great job in wrangling the cats on getting actual words on paper that have, cohesion and direction. So I really appreciate Daniel in that, really appreciate Nick and your leadership in developing this report. And also, thank you for the collaborative and really great discussion, set of discussions we had on how to develop this report. So appreciate board members very much on that. If there are no board questions or additional comments on the report, I'll ask the Office of the Independent Monitor if there's anything you would like to say, either regarding the report or anything else. Open it to you.
Other than to thank the COB board for such dedication to the work of oversight and for on behalf of the community, considering that it is a volunteer board, the amount of hours and work that goes into this report and our bi-monthly meetings is above and beyond what any kind of volunteer position would entail. And so just on behalf of the OIM, we thank you.
Appreciate that. And just a note of process, when we develop our report, we allow many city stakeholders to provide their feedback in advance of our publication. While we don't always accept the feedback in our changes, we have received it. And, that includes everyone from city attorney's office, public safety departments, and the monitor's office. So, our hope is not to surprise anyone. And really, the work we do day in and day out is the thing that will, help to indicate to the public that none of these recommendations should be surprising to folks. So no big reveal, and no hot press on this, but we really appreciate the collaboration and feedback that we received from you on this. Okay, I think that's all we have. If the monitor's office has any items that can be discussed in the public, turn it over to you for that. And then if not, if there are any open or ongoing investigations you'd like to discuss with the board in our executive session, let me know.
Nothing further for the open session. We would like to proceed to executive session.
Okay. Daniel reminds me that we do have a little board business. I forgot. If board members had a chance to review the minutes from our previous meeting.
Move to approve.
Great. I'll second that. Okay, thanks, Karen. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, thank you. The motion passes. One other item is that follow-up from our previous meeting was to provide Larry some feedback on the public engagement, rough cut approach. And so Larry, I don't know if you've gotten any feedback on that, but maybe just a reminder to board members to review what was shared in the previous meeting and then provide feedback. And Larry and Daniel, probably makes sense for us to get back together to kind of continue to push that forward. Okay. Let me go back to my agenda and make sure I've covered all of our board business. Okay, I think that's it. With that, may I have a motion to adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Great. All right. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Great. Let's transition over to executive session. Thanks everyone for attending today. Appreciate it.